Have you ever wondered what happens when the scales of justice tip too far in the wrong direction? When those sworn to uphold the law become the very criminals they're meant to judge? Judge Harrison Blackwood had built his career on compromise. 30 years on the bench, and he'd learned that justice wasn't about right or wrong. It was about who could pay the most, who had the right connections, who whispered the sweetest promises in his ear. His reputation was sterling, his bank account substantial, and his conscience buried so deep it rarely stirred anymore. The antique shop on Elm Street had been closed for decades when Harrison first noticed it. Boarded windows, peeling paint, a for sale sign so weathered the text was barely visible. But something had changed. The boards were gone, warm light spilled from clean windows, and an elegant sign simply read, "Curiosities and Antiquities." Harrison pushed open the heavy door, a brass bell announcing his arrival with a sound that seemed to echo longer than physics should allow. The shop was impossibly deep, stretching back into shadows that the overhead lights couldn't quite penetrate. Shelves lined every wall, packed with objects that seemed to watch him as he passed. Looking for anything particular? The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, smooth as aged whiskey. An elderly man emerged from behind a towering bookshelf, his silver hair perfectly groomed, his suit impeccably tailored. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, and when he smiled, Harrison felt something cold crawl up his spine. "Just browsing," Harrison replied, though his gaze had already fixed on something extraordinary. Behind the counter, displayed on a pedestal of dark wood, sat a gavel unlike any he'd ever seen. The handle was carved from what looked like obsidian, so black it seemed to absorb light. The head was crafted from silver so pure it practically glowed, inscribed with symbols that hurt to look at directly. "Ah, you have excellent taste," the shopkeeper said, following Harrison's gaze. "That's a very special piece. 17th century, they say. Belonged to Judge Cornelius Thorne of Salem. He was known for his uncompromising sense of justice." Harrison's fingers itched to touch it. "How much?" The old man's smile widened. "For you? Consider it a gift. From one servant of justice to another." Before Harrison could protest, the man had wrapped the gavel in black silk and pressed it into his hands. The moment his fingers closed around it, the world seemed to shift slightly, like looking at a familiar photograph from a different angle. "Use it well," the shopkeeper whispered, and Harrison could have sworn he heard laughter in those words. That night, Harrison placed the gavel on his desk at home, admiring how it seemed to command the room. He'd always been drawn to antiques, but this felt different. This felt like it belonged to him, like it had been waiting for him. The next morning brought the Hendricks case, a wealthy businessman accused of embezzling pension funds from his employees. The evidence was overwhelming, but Hendricks had made substantial contributions to Harrison's campaign fund. The trial would be a formality. As Harrison took his seat, his fingers automatically reached for his usual gavel. Instead, they found the obsidian handle of his new acquisition. He'd brought it without even thinking about it, as if his hands had acted on their own. The prosecution presented their case with devastating precision. Thousands of retirees had lost their life savings, families destroyed, lives ruined. But as Harrison listened, all he could think about was the new boat Hendricks had promised to help him purchase. A small favor between friends. "In the case of the state versus Hendricks," Harrison began, raising the antique gavel, "I find the defendant—" He paused. The gavel felt warm in his hand, almost alive. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. "Guilty on all counts." The words left his mouth before he'd consciously decided to speak them. The gavel struck the block with a sound like thunder, and Harrison felt something shift inside his chest, like a lock clicking open. Hendricks's face went white. His lawyer sputtered. The prosecution looked shocked. Harrison was equally stunned by his own words, but as he looked out at the faces in the gallery, at the families who would now see justice served, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: satisfaction. That evening, Harrison received a call that Hendricks had suffered a massive heart attack in his cell. Dead at 52, with no previous history of heart problems. Coincidence, Harrison told himself, but the gavel seemed to pulse with warmth when he touched it. The pattern continued. Case after case, Harrison found himself delivering verdicts based on actual evidence rather than financial incentives. And case after case, those he found guilty met with swift, inexplicable justice. A hit-and-run driver wrapped his car around a tree on his way home from sentencing. A corrupt politician choked to death on his victory dinner. A child abuser fell down a flight of stairs in his apartment building. Harrison should have been terrified. Instead, he felt more alive than he had in decades. This was real justice, pure and absolute. The gavel had awakened something in him, shown him what he was truly meant to be. But the gavel's influence didn't stop at the courtroom. Harrison began to notice things. The way his housekeeper flinched when she thought he wasn't looking. The fear in his secretary's eyes when she brought him coffee. The whispered conversations that stopped when he entered a room. One night, unable to sleep, Harrison found himself in his study, staring at the gavel. In the lamplight, the silver head seemed to shift and move, the strange symbols rearranging themselves into new patterns. "You've been busy," a familiar voice said from the shadows. Harrison spun around. The elderly shopkeeper sat in his reading chair, looking exactly as he had in the store. "How did you get in here?" "The same way I've gotten into every room you've ever entered, Harrison." "Through the door you opened 30 years ago, when you first decided that justice was for sale." The old man stood, and Harrison noticed that his shadow fell wrong, stretching in directions that defied the room's lighting. "You think the gavel has been helping you serve justice," the stranger continued. "But justice isn't what you've been serving, is it? You've been serving vengeance, punishment, the very corruption you once embraced, turned inside out." Harrison's hand moved to the gavel, drawing strength from its cold surface. "Those people deserved what they got. They were criminals." "Yes, they were. Just like you." The words hit Harrison like a physical blow. I've been serving justice. Real justice." "Have you? Tell me, Harrison, about the Morrison case. 5 years ago, a young mother accused of stealing baby formula to feed her hungry child. What was your verdict?" The memory surfaced unbidden. Sarah Morrison, thin and desperate, pleading with him to understand. The store owner who'd pressed charges was a major donor to the courthouse renovation fund. Harrison had thrown the book at her. 6 months in county jail, away from her infant son. "She broke the law," Harrison whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. "She died in that cell, Harrison. Pneumonia, brought on by the conditions you knew existed there. Her baby went into foster care. He's 8 now, been through 6 different homes. Tell me, where was justice for them?" More memories flooded back. The teenager he'd sentenced to adult prison for a minor drug offense, knowing what would happen to him there. The elderly man he'd evicted in winter for a landlord who'd promised him a favorable ruling in an upcoming case. The domestic violence victim he'd failed to protect because her abuser was a police captain's brother. Each memory brought with it a face, a name, a life destroyed by his corruption. "The gavel doesn't create justice," the old man said softly. "It simply reflects it. Every verdict you've delivered, every punishment you've meted out, has been nothing more than a mirror of your own crimes. The guilty have been punished, yes, but by someone far guiltier than they ever were." Harrison's hand tightened on the gavel, and suddenly he understood. The warmth he felt wasn't the satisfaction of justice served. It was the heat of his own damnation, growing stronger with each hypocritical verdict. "What are you?" he asked. The old man smiled, and his face began to change, features shifting like smoke. "I am what you made me, Harrison. I am the sum of every injustice you've ever committed, every life you've destroyed, every time you've sold your soul for 30 pieces of silver. I am your conscience, finally given form." The room began to spin around Harrison. The walls stretched upward, transforming into the familiar paneling of his courtroom. But now he sat in the defendant's chair, and the old man stood behind the judge's bench, the obsidian gavel in his weathered hands. "Harrison Blackwood," the figure intoned, and his voice echoed with the authority of absolute judgment. "You stand accused of corruption, of perverting justice, of destroying countless innocent lives for personal gain. How do you plead?" Harrison tried to speak, but no words came. Around him, the courtroom filled with faces. Sarah Morrison, pale and accusing. The teenager, bearing the scars of his prison years. The elderly man, frozen and blue. Hundreds of others, all the lives he'd touched with his corruption. "The defendant's silence speaks loudly enough," the judge continued. "The evidence is overwhelming. The verdict is clear." The gavel rose, its silver head catching light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Guilty on all counts." The gavel fell with a sound like the closing of a tomb. The next morning, courthouse staff found Judge Harrison Blackwood slumped over his desk, apparently dead from a heart attack. In his hand, they found an antique gavel, its obsidian handle warm to the touch, despite the cold morning air. The gavel was donated to the courthouse museum, where it sits today behind glass, waiting. The placard reads, "Antique Judicial Gavel, circa 1600s, origin unknown." Sometimes, late at night, courthouse employees swear they can hear it calling, not to them, but to someone else. Someone who believes that justice is just another commodity to be bought and sold. Because true justice, you see, never rests. It simply waits for the next judge to take the bench, the next hand to grasp its handle, the next soul to learn that in the cosmic courtroom, we are all both judge and defendant. and the gavel always delivers its verdict.